The Atlantic groaned beneath a steel-grey sky in 1742, its waters holding secrets darker than any storm cloud. Deep in the bowels of a slave ship, iron chains drew blood from dark skin as a woman lay motionless, her breath matching the rhythm of the waves. They thought the chains would break her spirit. They were wrong. Her voice rose first as a whisper, ancient words carried on salt-laden air, then built into a keening that made the timbers shiver. The manacles grew cold as midwinter ice, while outside, the sea itself seemed to pause, listening. Strange waters rose against natural tides, and in the darkness below deck, something ancient stirred to her call. When had the ocean last heard such raw power in a human voice? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Adana remembered warmth, the kind that came from African sun on bare shoulders, from morning mist rising off the river, where her grandmother taught her to sing to the water spirits. That was before the iron, before the ship, before Captain Morris's boot pressed into her spine as he inspected his cargo. The manacle around her right wrist bore strange markings, symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light filtering through the deckboards above. They weren't the maker's mark she'd seen on other chains. These characters twisted like tiny serpents, ancient glyphs that reminded her of the patterns her grandmother would draw in riverside sand during their ceremonies. "Keep that one separate," Morris had ordered when they first brought her aboard, his weathered face tightening as he examined her grandmother's coral necklace. "There's something different about her eyes." He'd tried to snatch the necklace, but the cord had snapped, scattering beads across the deck. Adana had lunged for them, earning her first lashing and a night without water. That had been 3 weeks ago, or perhaps 4. Time moved strangely in the hold, marked only by the rhythm of meals and the changing of guards. Yet something else had changed too. The iron that bound her felt different from the chains she'd first worn, colder, almost alive. She'd noticed it first during prayer, when her whispered words to the old gods made the metal frost over despite the hold's stifling heat. The guard who'd spotted it had recoiled, crossing himself before hurrying above deck. Word spread quickly. Among the crew after that, they began approaching her with a mixture of fear and cruel fascination, some making signs against evil, others testing their power with extra brutality. But it was First Mate Richardson who truly saw her. He'd served on ships plying these waters for 30 years, and something in his rheumy eyes told her he recognized what she was becoming. "The sea chooses its own," he'd muttered one night, pretending to check her chains while pressing a cup of fresh water into her hands. "My grandmother sailed with a woman like you. Before the end, she could call storms with her songs." Adana held those words close, letting them kindle hope in the darkness. She began testing her powers in small ways. When the guards brought the daily water ration, she found she could sense every drop in the bucket, could feel the liquid responding to her will. It started with ripples, tiny disturbances that could be dismissed as the ship's motion. But soon she could make the water move against the sway of the waves, could make it dance in defiance of nature's laws. The other prisoners noticed. How could they not? They saw how her section of the hold never grew quite as foul as the rest. How small streams of clean water would mysteriously find their way to the weakest among them. Some began to whisper that she was blessed by the old gods. Others feared her growing power would bring worse treatment upon them all. Mercy, a young woman chained nearby, became her first true ally. She'd been taken from a different village, but knew the old stories. "My mother spoke of women who could command the sea," she whispered one night. She said they were descendants of water spirits, that the ocean itself remembered their bloodline. Each night, Adana practiced. She learned to feel the vast presence of the ocean beyond the hull, its immense power thrumming against her consciousness like a second heartbeat. The ship's timbers couldn't block her connection to the water any more than they could block the air, she breathed. It was during these sessions that she discovered her manacle's true nature. The strange markings began to glow with a faint, bluish light whenever she called to the sea. At first, she thought it was a trick of her tired eyes, but Mercy saw it too. The metal seemed to resonate with her power, amplifying rather than restraining it. These were no ordinary chains. They had history, purpose, and their own kind of magic. Captain Morris must have suspected something. His visits to the hold grew more frequent, his hard eyes studying her chains with growing unease. He began asking questions about her village, her family, particularly about her grandmother. Each question carried the weight of fear, barely masked. By authority, the breaking point came when he ordered her chains replaced. The new iron burned against her skin, but not with the cold fire of her original manacles. These were dead metal, mundane and cruel. The change sent waves of wrongness through her being, like a song suddenly silenced. That night, she dreamed of her grandmother standing ankle-deep in their river, drawing those same serpentine symbols in the sand as the water rose to embrace them. "The sea remembers its children," her grandmother's voice echoed in the dream, "and iron that has tasted salt water once can be made to remember too." Adana woke with tears frozen on her cheeks and a new understanding burning in her heart. The guards found frost coating her new chains that morning, spreading outward like tiny, crystalline fingers reaching for freedom. They didn't notice that the strange markings from her old manacles had begun appearing on these chains too, as if carved by an invisible hand. She waited, gathering her strength like the ocean gathering a wave. The ship creaked its way through darkening waters, and in the hold, Adana began to sing, not the broken work songs the guards expected to hear, but the ancient melodies her grandmother had taught her. Songs of tide and storm, of depths where light had never reached, of power that slept beneath the waves waiting to be called. The chains grew colder with each note. First Mate Richardson's next visit came during the darkest watch of night, when even the rats slept in the ship's bones. He carried something wrapped in oilcloth, pressed against his chest like a guilty secret. The leather-bound book he revealed made Adana's chains grow cold, not from her power, but from recognition of something ancient and wrong. "The captain's ledger," Richardson whispered, his gnarled fingers trembling as he turned pages by lantern light. "Been sailing with Morris for 15 years. Thought I knew every dark thing about him until I found this." The writing wasn't in English, but in a script that resembled the markings on Adana's original chains. "7 ships," he continued, voice barely audible above the creaking timbers. "7 ships he's captained, each one carrying someone like you. The log entries go back decades before he was even born, inherited from his father and his father. Before him, they've been hunting your kind." Mercy leaned closer, her chains rattling softly. "What happens to them? The others like Adana?" Richardson's weathered face grew darker. "They never reached shore. Each voyage ends with the same entry. Power consumed, vessels strengthened. I didn't understand until I saw your chains glow, girl. They're not just selling slaves. They're harvesting power." The revelation settled like ice in Adana's stomach. She'd noticed how the ship seemed to cut through waves too easily, how it weathered storms that should have splintered lesser vessels. The timber beneath her fingers hummed with an energy that felt wrong, stolen. "There's more," Richardson said, turning to the ledger's final pages. "Morris is taking us to a place called the Sleeping Deep. According to this, it's where the ritual must be performed, where the power transfer is strongest." Adana closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's warnings about places where the ocean floor dropped away into bottomless darkness, places where ancient things slumbered, waiting to be awakened. "How long?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4. The signs are already appearing, birds flying the wrong direction, fish following the ship like they're being pulled by invisible currents. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. The crew's starting to notice too, even the ones who don't. "Know about the ledger can feel something's different this voyage." As if confirming his words, the ship groaned, a deep, hollow sound, unlike its usual creaking. Adana felt the vibration through her chains, and for a moment the markings flared. with that now familiar blue light. "Listen carefully," Richardson said, his voice urgent. "Morris keeps a piece of coral in his cabin, black as night and carved with the same symbols as your chains. According to the ledger, it's the key to the ritual. Without it, he can't complete the transfer," Adana finished, understanding blooming like dawn. The first mate nodded. "But getting to it won't be easy. The cabin's always locked, and Morris wears the key around his neck. Even if you reached it, there are guards posted day and night." Mercy spoke up, her voice carrying the strength of decision. "Tell us everything about the guard rotations. Who drinks too much? Who sleeps at their post? Who might look the other way for a few coins?" As Richardson shared the ship's secrets, Adana felt the ocean's presence more strongly than ever. It pressed against the hull like a living thing, responding to her growing understanding of what was at stake. This wasn't just about her freedom anymore. It was about stopping a centuries-old cycle of theft and murder. The next day brought new eyes watching her. Crew members who had ignored her before now lingered when bringing food or water, studying her with a mixture of fear and greed. They knew what she was worth now, what power she represented. Some saw a chance for profit in betraying their captain. Others, a chance to curry favor by reporting any suspicious behavior. But they weren't the only ones observing. Adana had begun to notice things too, patterns in the ship's operation that Richardson's information helped her understand. The guard who always stumbled slightly during the midnight watch, still affected by the rum he drank at sunset. The loose board near the stairs that could mask the sound of moving chains. The way sound carried through the ship's bones, letting her track movement above deck by the vibrations in her chains. Most importantly, she learned to read the crew's fear. It radiated from them like heat, growing stronger as they drew closer to the sleeping deep. Even Morris, during his increasingly frequent inspections, couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands when he checked her chains. They feared her power, yes, but they feared something else more, something waiting in the depths ahead. Adana smiled in the darkness, tasting salt on her lips, though she hadn't touched seawater in weeks. Let them fear the deep. She had learned its songs at her grandmother's knee, had always known that true power came not from stealing it, but from being chosen to receive it. That night, as the ship sailed closer to its destination, Adana began teaching Mercy the water songs. Other prisoners listened silently, learning the rhythms that made the chains grow cold and the sea press closer. Against the hull, they were building something together, not just an escape plan, but a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of Morris's dark legacy. The ledger had revealed his secrets, but it had also revealed his weakness. He needed ceremony, ritual, and stolen artifacts to command the sea's power. Adana only needed to remember who she was, a daughter of the water, chosen by the tide itself. In the darkness of the hold, surrounded by the soft singing of her fellow prisoners, she felt the first real stirring of hope. The ship continued its journey toward the sleeping deep, unaware that its cargo held more power than its captain could possibly imagine. The escape attempt came too soon. Looking back, Adana would blame desperation, the kind that spreads through a ship's hold like fever, making even the wisest minds reckless. It started when young Thomas, a new guard barely old enough to grow whiskers, dropped his keyring while delivering water rations. The keys landed near Mercy's feet, and for one breathless moment freedom seemed as simple as reaching down. But Thomas wasn't as green as he appeared. His sword cleared its scabbard before Mercy's fingers could brush metal, and the alarm brought 3 more guards pounding down the stairs. What happened next taught Adana the true price of power. They took Mercy above deck. The sounds that followed would haunt Adana's dreams. The whistle of the lash, the impact of leather on flesh, Mercy's defiant silence that eventually broke into screams. Each stroke sent vibrations through the ship's timbers, and with each vibration, Adana felt her rage grow colder, deeper, more focused. The chains around her wrists frosted over completely, the strange markings blazing with blue fire. She pulled at the ocean, no longer caring if anyone saw her power. Water began seeping up through the hull planks, moving against gravity, gathering in pools that reflected the ghostly glow of her bonds. "Stop!" The command came from old Joseph, chained 3 places down. His voice carried the weight of decades at sea. "Not yet, child. That's what they want, to see your power, to know its limits. Wait, listen." Adana forced herself to breathe, to let the water recede before the guards returned. Old Joseph was right. She couldn't afford to show everything she could do. Not. Yet instead, she turned her attention to the ship itself, pressing her awareness into every crack and crevice where water might hide. That's when she felt it, a presence in the bilge water below, something that resonated with her power like a struck bell. When night fell and the hold grew quiet, except for Mercy's labored breathing, Adana began to sing, not the powerful songs that stirred the sea, but softer melodies meant to call smaller waters. The bilge water responded, carrying with it a strange gift, a piece of coral, shaped exactly like a key, encrusted with tiny symbols that matched her chains. When she finally managed to draw it close enough to touch, the coral felt warm against her palm, pulsing with its own inner light. "It's a talisman," old Joseph whispered, his eyes wide in the darkness. "I've heard tales, pieces of the ocean's memory, shaped by old magic. Some say they can unlock any bond made by human hands." Adana studied the coral key in the dim light filtering through the deck boards. Its shape seemed to shift slightly, when she wasn't looking directly at it, as if it couldn't quite decide what form to take. But more importantly, she could feel its power resonating with her chains, creating harmonies in the song she always felt, flowing through the sea. Over the next 3 days, she learned its secrets. The coral responded to the same songs that moved the ocean, changing shape subtly with each melody. By the second night, she could make it grow warm or cold at will. By the third, she discovered that touching it to her chains made the markings glow brighter, strengthening her connection to the waters beyond the hull. But it was Mercy who realized its true potential. "The markings," she said, her voice still rough from screaming, "they're not just like the ones on your chains. They're exactly the same, as if they were carved by the same hand." Adana pressed the coral against her manacles again, watching the patterns align perfectly. "Or by the same power," she whispered. The ship chose that moment to creak ominously, timbers flexing as if in response to her words. The discovery changed everything. What they had taken for random patterns were actually fragments of a larger design, one that seemed to continue from the coral onto her chains and possibly beyond. Each piece carried part of a song older than the ship, older perhaps than human memory of the sea itself. More prisoners were learning the water songs now. At night, their voices would rise and fall in whispered harmony, making the chains grow cold and the coral key pulse with answering light. Even those who couldn't sing could feel the power building in the hold, like pressure before a storm. But power brought attention. The guards grew more nervous, jumping at shadows and crossing themselves constantly. Twice more, they took prisoners above deck for discipline, trying to provoke another display of Adana's abilities. She kept the coral key hidden and her songs quiet, but she couldn't hide how the sea itself seemed to be pressing closer against the hull, making the ship roll strangely even in calm waters. Captain Morris appeared again, this time with a scholar in tow, a pale, nervous man who spent hours studying Adana's chains through a brass spyglass. She heard him later, arguing with Morris in the passage above. "The convergence is wrong," the scholar insisted. "The stars aren't aligned properly for the ritual. If we proceed now, we proceed as planned." Morris's voice cut through the protest like a blade. "I won't risk losing another one, not when we're this close." That night, Richardson smuggled down news that chilled Adana more than any chain. They were a day's sail from the sleeping deep, and Morris had ordered all hands to prepare for the ritual. But it was what the first mate had overheard in the captain's cabin that truly frightened her. He was talking to something in that black coral of his, Richardson whispered. Something answered him. Whatever power sleeps in those depths, it's awake now, waiting. Adana clutched her coral key, feeling its warmth pulse against her palm like a tiny heartbeat. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice. Attempt escape before they reach the sleeping deep, or wait and risk facing whatever ancient horror Morris meant to feed her to. The key grew warmer, and in its light, she saw Mercy watching her with understanding in her eyes. They both knew there was really no choice at all. The time for hiding their power was over. The navigator's death changed everything. They found him at dawn, slumped over his charts with eyes wide and skin colder than the morning air. His last act had been to draw a series of interlocking circles on the ship's maps, the ink still wet when Richardson discovered the body. "The patterns," Richardson whispered to Adana during his midnight visit. "They match the markings on your chains." He pressed a rolled parchment into her hands, the navigator's final work, stolen from his cabin before Morris could claim it. In the dim light of the hold, the charts told a story that made Adana's blood run cold. Their course wasn't the random wandering of a slave ship seeking ports. It was a deliberate pattern, tracing an ancient symbol across the face of the Atlantic. Each previous voyage she'd learned about from the captain's ledger formed part of a larger design, and this journey would complete it. The navigator had seen it, had understood what they were really part of, and that knowledge had killed him. "Look here," Mercy whispered, pointing to a section of the chart where several lines converged. "That's where we're headed, the sleeping deep. But these other marks," she traced the faded ink with a trembling finger. "They're dates, times when the stars align with points in the ocean, times when the water remembers." The ship's timbers groaned, and somewhere above, a sailor shouted about strange lights in the water. The sound of running feet thundered across the deck as the crew scrambled to their stations. Through it all, Adana studied the charts, memorizing every line and symbol. She recognized some of the markings from her grandmother's teachings, ancient. Warnings about places where the sea grew thin, where other worlds pressed close against the membrane of reality. But these charts showed something her grandmother had never mentioned. The patterns could be used to channel power, to tear holes in that membrane if you knew the right songs. Morris knew the songs, or at least he thought he did. That day brought changes that even the most hardened sailors couldn't ignore. Schools of fish followed the ship, their scales gleaming with unnatural light. Seabirds wheeled overhead in formations too precise to be natural, their cries carrying hints of harmony that made the crew cover their ears. But it was the water itself that caused the most fear. It no longer moved like proper ocean, instead, flowing in patterns that matched the navigator's charts. Those who looked too long into the waves reported seeing shapes moving in the depths, vast, shadowy forms that seemed to dance to music no living ear was meant to hear. The crew's unrest grew with each passing hour. Adana could hear them arguing above deck, their voices carrying clearly through the wooden ceiling of the hold. Some wanted to change course, to head for the nearest port. Others insisted on following Morris's orders, though whether from loyalty or fear, she couldn't tell. "The old stars are wrong," one sailor wailed during the midnight watch. "Been sailing 30 years and never seen the North Star dance like that." He was right. Through the cracks in the deck, Adana could see the stars performing impossible movements, tracing patterns that matched the markings on her chains. The coral key in her hidden possession grew warmer with each passing hour, as if responding to some approaching power. Richardson brought more news with the evening rations. "Morris has locked himself in his cabin with that black coral of his. Been in there 3 days now, talking to himself, or to something else. The new navigator won't go near the charts. Says they make his eyes bleed if he looks at them too long." Adana nodded, unsurprised. She'd felt the power building, had seen how it affected everyone differently. The prisoners who'd learned her water songs seemed stronger, more focused. But those who resisted, who tried to deny the change coming over the ship, suffered headaches, nosebleeds, waking nightmares. "There's something else," Richardson added, his voice dropping even lower. The ship's carpenter swears the hold is changing shape, says the measurements are different every time he checks them, and the bilge water, he shuddered, it's not draining right. Flows up instead of down sometimes, Adana had noticed. The water responded to her now without any need for songs. It came when she called, moved how she willed, carried whispered messages to other prisoners. Her powers were growing stronger as they approached the sleeping deep, but so was something else, something vast and hungry that watched from beneath the waves. That night she studied the charts again, tracing the complex paths of their journey. According to the navigators' calculations, they would reach the center of the pattern tomorrow at midnight. The very heart of the symbol Morris had spent years drawing across the ocean with the blood and power of people like her. But the navigator had seen something Morris hadn't. Hidden in the corners of the charts, written in a shaking hand, were warnings. The pattern goes both ways, power flows in two directions. What is drawn can be undrawn. Mercy saw the change come over Adana's face as understanding dawned. You've found something. Not something, Adana replied, feeling the coral key pulse against her skin in response to her rising excitement. Everything. Morris thinks he's using these patterns to channel power from the ocean into his ship, but he's really creating a connection, a door that can open from either side. The implications hung in the air between them. If Morris could use the patterns to draw power from the ocean, then someone with the right knowledge, someone born to the water, trained in its oldest songs, could use those same patterns to draw power from the ship itself. Someone like her. A sudden wave crashed against the hull, harder than any natural swell. The ship shuddered, and in that moment every chain in the hold grew cold enough to crack. Above deck, men screamed as impossible lights danced across the waves. The time for waiting was nearly over. Adana pressed her hand against the damp wood of the hull, feeling the stolen power thrumming through the vessel's bones. Tomorrow, she would begin unweaving what Morris had spent generations weaving. Tomorrow, she would remind him why the old stories warned against chaining the daughters of the sea. Morris came for her before dawn, when the stars still traced their impossible patterns across the sky. He brought 6 guards, the ship's surgeon, and a brass compass that spun wildly the moment he entered the hold. The air grew thick with the scent of ceremonial incense, myrrh, and something older, darker, that made Adana's nose bleed. "Chain her to the mast," Morris ordered, but stopped the guards when they reached for her. "No, wait!" He held up the compass, watching its needle whirl like a dancer gone mad. "These chains first. They've been corrupted." The surgeon stepped forward, a ring of iron manacles in his hands. New ones, unmarked by any symbols. Dead metal that had never tasted salt water or power. But when he reached for Adana's bonds, the compass exploded. Brass shrapnel peppered the hold's walls. The surgeon screamed, clutching his slashed face. And in that moment of chaos, Adana saw what Morris had tried to hide beneath his coat. The black coral, pulsing with sickly green light. "Hold her!" Morris's voice cracked with desperation. The guards rushed forward, but Adana was already singing, not the subtle songs of before, but the full-throated hymn her grandmother had taught her for moments when life and death hung in the balance. The first guard's chains, the very ones they'd brought to bind her, leaped from his hands and wrapped around his own throat. The second stumbled back as the metal began to frost over, spreading a killing cold up his arms. The third managed to land a blow, his club cracking against Adana's shoulder. Pain blossomed, but with it came something else. The ship itself seemed to shudder in sympathy, and every piece of metal in the hold began to sing. "Stop her!" Morris roared, but his voice was lost in the chorus of iron and brass, steel and bronze. Every nail and fitting, every hook and chain joined Adana's song. The compass's shattered pieces rose from the floor, dancing in the air like stars fallen to earth. The remaining guards fled. Only Morris stood his ground, clutching his black coral like a shield. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, girl. The power in these waters, it's older than your songs, older than your gods." "No!" Adana felt blood trickling from her nose, but her voice remained strong. "You're the one who doesn't understand. The water remembers. Every drop that ever passed through your ships, every life you sacrificed to feed your hunger. The sea holds it all." She pulled harder on her power, and the metal responded. Her chains began to crack, frost spreading through the iron like lightning through storm clouds. The coral key hidden against her skin burned hot enough to scorch. Morris's face twisted. He raised the black coral, beginning a chant in a language that made the air itself recoil. Dark water started seeping up through the deckboards, not the clean seawater that answered Adana's call, but something ancient and wrong. The ship groaned as if in pain. In the darkness between decks, prisoners began to scream. Mercy's voice rose above the chaos. "The charts! Remember the charts!" Adana's mind raced back to the navigator's final warnings. The patterns went both ways. What was drawn could be undrawn. She changed her song mid-note, matching her voice to the harmonies hidden in the navigator's charts. The effect was immediate. Every piece of metal in the hold, every chain, nail, and fitting that had been marked by Morris's rituals over the years, began to resonate with her voice. The black coral in Morris's hands flickered, its sickly light faltering. "No!" he struck her across the face, breaking her song. "I didn't spend 3 generations building this power to let some slave girl undo it all." But the blow had cost him. In striking her, he'd brought the black coral too close to her chains. The 2 pieces of ancient magic recognized each other, twin keys to the same lock. Power surged between them like lightning. Morris screamed as the coral burned in his hands. He tried to drop it, but the magic had him now. Dark water rose around his feet, trying to answer his panic, but Adana's song was stronger. The water remembered her blood, recognized the daughter of its ancient daughters. Her chains shattered. The sound rang through the ship like a bell tolling the end of the world. Every other chain in the hold burst apart in sympathy. Prisoners scrambled to their feet, free for the first time in weeks or months. Morris staggered back, his fine coat smoking where the black coral had branded him. "Kill her!" he screamed to guards who were no longer there. "Kill them all!" But Adana wasn't finished. The shattered compass rose from the floor, its pieces swirling around her like a storm of brass and glass. Each fragment caught the light of her power, reflecting it back 100-fold until she stood in a column of blue-white radiance. "The sea remembers," she said, her voice carrying harmonies no human throat should have been able to produce. The compass pieces began to spin faster, describing patterns that matched the navigator's charts. "And so do I." Morris turned to flee, but the dark water he'd summoned betrayed him. It rose up around his legs, holding him in place as Adana approached. The black coral slipped from his nerveless fingers, and Mercy darted forward to snatch it away. "Wait," Morris gasped. "You don't know what you're doing. The things sleeping in the deep, I'm the only one who knows how to control them. They were never meant to be controlled." Adana touched one finger to the brand the coral had left on his chest. Frost spread from the point of contact, crackling across his skin like breaking ice. They were meant to be remembered, honored, asked, not commanded. Above deck, men began screaming as the sea itself rose up against the ship's sides. The vessel shuddered, timbers creaking as ancient power surged through its bones. And through it all, the broken compass continued its dance, marking the moment when the daughter of the sea finally broke her chains. The ship's bell began ringing at midnight. No hand touched its rope, no wind stirred its clapper, yet its voice rang out across the waves, a deep, resonant tone that made the timbers shiver. The sound carried harmonics no human-forged bell should produce, echoes that seemed to answer something calling from the deep. "It's starting," Richardson whispered, helping Adana up the narrow stairs to the main deck. "The old stories say the bells always know first when the sea is about to claim its due." The night air hit her like a physical blow after weeks in the hold. Stars wheeled overhead in impossible patterns, while phosphorescent waves crashed against the hull. The freed prisoners emerged behind her, moving quietly despite their newfound liberty. They all felt it. The charge in the air, the sense of ancient forces gathering. Morris stood by the helm, surrounded by his most loyal crew members. The Black Coral's brand still smoked on his chest, but his voice rang with authority as he shouted orders. "Double the watch! Any prisoner who resists goes over the side, and someone silence that damn bell." 3 sailors had already tried. They lay groaning on the deck, their hands blistered as if they'd grabbed red-hot iron instead of bronze. The bell continued its otherworldly tolling, each note now accompanied by answering calls from beneath the waves. "Look at the water," Mercy breathed, gripping the rail. The sea around the ship had turned mirror-smooth despite the wind, reflecting the chaos of stars above. But in those reflections, other lights moved. Pale shapes that swam through the constellation patterns like fish through a reef. As Adana watched, the shapes began to form familiar patterns, the same symbols that marked her broken chains, that filled the navigator's charts. The ship's bell rang louder, and this time the whole vessel trembled in response. From his position near the helm, Morris cursed, "Get her back below, now, before—" The rest of his words were lost, as every piece of metal on the ship began to sing. Nails hummed in their joints, hooks vibrated in their sockets, and the great anchor chain rattled with a sound like distant thunder. The music built into a chord that set Adana's teeth on edge and made several sailors drop to their knees, clutching their heads. But it was the bell's voice that dominated, deep, insistent, calling to something in the starlit waters below. Each toll now shook loose another piece of Morris's carefully constructed power. Adana could see it happening, decades of stolen magic unraveling like rope under too much strain. "The bell knows," old Joseph's voice carried across the deck. "It remembers every soul that passed beneath it in chains. Every prayer, every curse, every song of mourning." Morris drew his pistol, but the powder in its pan had turned to brine. "Take her!" he screamed at his men. "Take her, or we all—" The bell's next toll cut him off, this note so deep it seemed to come from the ocean floor itself. The black coral Mercy had taken from Morris began to pulse in response, its sickly green light fighting against the clean blue radiance of Adana's power. "It's not just the bell," Richardson said, his weathered face pale in the starlight. "Listen!" Other bells were answering, their voices carrying impossible distances across the water, the calls of every ship's bell that had ever rung over these waters, every chapel bell that had tolled for sailors lost at sea, every diving bell that had carried men down into the deep. Their combined voice built into a chorus that made the night air shimmer. Adana felt power surge through her, clean and cold as the deepest ocean. The coral key pressed against her skin burned in harmony with the bells, and when she opened her mouth to sing, her voice carried the same otherworldly resonance. The sea responded. Waves rose against the natural wind, lifting the ship in a cradle of foam and fury. Phosphorescent shapes circled beneath the surface, vast, ancient forms drawn by the bell's calling. The stars above wheeled faster, tracing patterns that matched the navigator's charts with terrible precision. "Please!" Morris staggered toward her, his fine coat soaked with sweat despite the chill air. "You don't understand what you're waking." "The things I made bargains with, the prices I paid." "We were the price," Adana answered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the bell ring louder. "All of us. Every soul you sacrificed to feed your ship's hunger, but the sea remembers its children." The bell's tolling reached a fever pitch. Salt water began weeping from the wooden walls of the captain's cabin, running upward against gravity. The ship's compass exploded in its housing, its needles spinning wildly, before pointing straight down toward the sleeping deep. Morris made one last desperate grab for control. He snatched a knife from his belt and lunged, not at Adana, but at Mercy, who still held the black coral. "If I can't command it," he snarled, "I'll send us all to the depths." But the sea had made its choice. A wave rose up between Morris and his target, solid as a wall of glass. In its transparent surface, Adana saw reflections of other ships. Of the times, all the vessels that had carried human cargo across these waters, all the captains who had thought they could bargain with powers they didn't understand. The bell rang one final time, a note that seemed to shake the stars themselves. And in that moment, every bargain was broken, every dark covenant undone. The wave crashed down on Morris with the weight of generations of stolen power returning to its source. When the water receded, the captain was gone, but the bell continued its song, calling to the things that swam in the deep, promising them that payment long overdue was finally coming due. The night was far from over. The chains didn't just break, they sang. Each link that shattered added its voice to the ship's bell's symphony, metal screaming as it tore itself apart. The broken pieces rose into the air, dancing like silver fish in the supernatural light, their edges sharp as betrayal and bright with ancient power. "Watch the guards!" Mercy's voice cut through the chaos as freed prisoners poured onto the deck. But the warning came too late for young Thomas, who crumpled with a crossbow bolt in his shoulder. Adana felt the boy's blood hit the deck, felt it through the water in his veins, through the salt that ran in all their bodies. Her rage rose cold and deadly as the deep ocean, and the floating chain fragments responded. They whirled through the air like a school of metallic predators, their broken ends seeking the crossbowman's throat. "No!" Old Joseph caught her arm. "Not like them, not with their methods." The chains froze in mid-flight, hovering like a deadly constellation. The crossbowman dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, babbling prayers to a god who had no power here. Around him, other crew members began throwing down their weapons, finally understanding what they faced. But not all of them surrendered. A core group of Morris's most loyal men had barricaded themselves around the helm, armed with boarding pikes and loaded pistols. Their leader, a scarred man named Hawkins, raised a speaking trumpet to his lips. "Think carefully, witch," he called, across the deck. "Even if you kill us all, you don't know how to sail this ship. The sleeping deep lies ahead, and these waters suffer no drifting vessel. Submit now, and we'll see you safely to port." Lightning crackled in the strange sky overhead, illuminating the faces of the freed prisoners. Some showed fear at Hawkins's words. They were farmers, craftsmen, people of the land. The sea's dangers were foreign to them. But others, those who had learned Adana's water songs in the hold, stood straighter. They knew the ocean had already chosen its side. "The chains remember too," Adana said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the floating metal shiver. "Every hand that forged them, every spell worked into their iron, every drop of blood they've tasted. Shall we ask them their opinion of your offer?" She reached out with her power, not to the chains themselves, but to the memory of bondage within them. Generations of pain and defiance had soaked into the metal, and now that power answered her call. The broken links began to glow with blue fire, each piece blazing with the accumulated rage of countless imprisoned souls. "Stand aside," she commanded, "or learn why your captain feared the sea's daughters." Hawkins spat on the deck. "Fire!" 6 pistols roared. 6 bullets flew true toward Adana's heart, but the chains moved faster, weaving themselves into a shield that caught the lead and held it suspended in midair. As the imprisoned prisoners watched in awe, the bullets began to transform, metal recognizing metal, lead flowing like quicksilver to join the dance of broken links. "The next shot," Adana warned, "I send back." That broke them. Most of the remaining crew threw down their weapons, some falling to their knees, others backing away toward the lifeboats. But Hawkins and 3 others charged forward with boarding pikes, desperate to end the witch's power before she could fully claim the ship. They never reached her. The chains struck like serpents, wrapping around arms and legs, lifting the attackers into the air. Not killing. Old Joseph's wisdom held her back from that, but restraining, binding the crew with the very bonds they had used to imprison others. "The wheel!" Richardson shouted from near the helm. "Someone who knows sailing! We're drifting toward the deep!" 4 of the freed prisoners rushed forward, men who had been sailors themselves before their capture. They took control of the ship's steering, while others moved to secure the sails. But the vessel fought them, timbers creaking in protest as they tried to turn away from the dangerous waters ahead. "The ship itself is ensorcelled," Richardson explained, his hands white-knuckled on a support rope. Morris spent years feeding it power. It has its own will now, its own hunger. It wants to reach the sleeping deep. Adana felt the truth of his words. The ship was like a living thing beneath her feet, its wooden bones thrumming with stolen magic. Every nail and plank had been soaked in the power of imprisoned souls, shaped by dark rituals into something that was no longer truly a vessel, but a floating prison powered by pain. She looked at the chains still hovering around her, fragments of iron that had been transformed by the same ceremonies, the same sacrifices. In their broken surfaces, she saw reflections of other ships, other captains who had tried to harness the sea's power through bondage and blood. "Then we break its will like we broke its chains," she declared. Moving to the center of the deck, Adana began to sing, not the furious songs of battle, but older melodies, the ones her grandmother had taught her for healing, for undoing, for setting right what had been twisted. The floating chains took up her song, each broken link adding its voice until the air shimmered with their music. The ship shuddered. Dark water began weeping from its timbers as Morris's spells started to unravel. The vessel's unnatural hunger fought against her power, trying to maintain its course toward the deep. But the chains sang louder, their song carrying the weight of justice long denied. "Look!" Mercy pointed to the broken link still dancing in the air. Where the metal had once been dark with rust and old blood, it now began to shine with a clean silver light. The runes and symbols Morris had carved into them were burning away, replaced by older markings, the true names of water and iron, written in a script that predated human bondage. The chains were remembering what they had been before human greed corrupted them, and as they remembered, so did the ship. The cutlass sang as it cut through the salt air, its blade drinking starlight. Once it had belonged to Morris's first mate, before Mercy claimed it in the chaos. Now its steel held an unnatural red sheen, as if decades of spilled blood had finally seeped into the metal itself. "Below!" Mercy's warning came just as more of Morris's loyal crew burst from the forward hatch, armed with weapons from the ship's secret armory. But these weren't ordinary swords and pistols. Each blade glowed with sickly green light that matched the black coral's power. "Blood-forged weapons!" Richardson gasped, recognizing them. "Morris didn't just corrupt the ship. He's been preparing for this moment for years." The enchanted weapons moved with terrible purpose, seeking not just flesh, but the very essence of their targets. When one blade nicked a freed prisoner's arm, his entire body began to fade like fog in morning sun. Only Adana's quick intervention, a splash of pure seawater drawn from the depths, prevented him from disappearing entirely. "They're trying to feed us to the deep," old Joseph's voice carried across the deck. "The weapons don't just kill, they harvest." Understanding bloomed cold in Adana's mind. Every aspect of Morris's operation had been designed to gather and channel power. Even in defeat, his preparations were trying to complete his ritual. But Mercy's captured cutlass proved to be something else entirely. Where the other weapons glowed green with stolen power, its red sheen seemed to actively resist Morris's enchantments. When it clashed with a blood-forged blade, the sickly light dimmed and wavered. "The sword remembers too," Adana realized, watching Mercy drive back 3 attackers. It seen too much death, held too much power. Like the chains, it's awakening to its own truth. The battle for the mid-deck became a dance of light and shadow. Green, glowing blades sought to harvest more souls for the deep, while Mercy's red cutlass moved like vengeance itself, its steel singing harmony with the ship's bell still tolling above. Adana split her focus between defending the unarmed prisoners and continuing her work on the ship's enchantments. The vessel fought her with every plank and nail, its timbers groaning as she tried to undo decades of dark magic. But the broken chains still dancing in the air lent her their power, their fragments reflecting starlight like hundreds of angry eyes. A scream of triumph drew her attention back to the fight. One of Morris's men had cornered 2 prisoners against the rail, his blood-forged sword raised for a killing blow. But before Adana could intervene, something extraordinary happened. The red cutlass flew from Mercy's hand as if thrown, but Mercy hadn't thrown it. The sword moved on its own, spinning through the air like a compass needle seeking true north. It struck the blood-forged blade with a sound like breaking chains, and both weapons shattered. In the explosion of metal, Adana saw something impossible. Every drop of blood the cutlass had ever tasted, every life it had ended, seemed to rise. A red mist in the cold air, but instead of dissipating, the mist formed patterns, the same symbols that marked her chains, that filled the navigator's charts. "It's not just the ship," she breathed, understanding finally dawning. "Everything they used to build their power, the weapons, the chains, the coral, it all remembers, and everything that remembers can be awakened." She raised her voice in a new song, calling not just to the sea, but to every object on the ship that had witnessed the years of suffering. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every blade that had ever drawn blood, every rope that had ever bound an unwilling hand, every piece of metal that had ever tasted. Pain began to resonate with her voice. The remaining blood-forged weapons turned in their wielders' hands, their enchanted steel remembering older, deeper loyalties than Morris's spells. Some simply crumbled to rust, others turned on their holders, forcing them to drop the blades or risk cutting themselves. But it was Mercy's shattered cutlass that showed the true path forward. As its fragments lay scattered on the deck, each piece began to glow with that same red light. The pattern they formed matched a section of the navigator's charts, a vital piece of the larger design. "Gather every piece," Adana commanded, "every fragment of every broken weapon. They're not just metal anymore. They're memories made solid, and we'll need them all." The freed prisoners worked quickly, collecting shards of steel that burned hot or cold at their touch. Even the splinters of the blood-forged weapons were collected, though they still pulsed, weakly with their sickly green light. As the last pieces were gathered, Adana felt the ship shudder beneath her feet. They were drawing closer to the sleeping deep. She could feel its pull now, a vast hunger that made Morris's ambitions seem like a child's greed in comparison. The scattered weapon fragments rose into the air at her call, joining the dance of broken chains. In their combined light, red steel and silver iron, she saw the next step of their journey, written in a language older than human script. "The weapons remember every death," she told her assembled allies. "The chains remember every captive. The ship remembers every soul it carried into darkness. And now," she smiled, feeling power pulse through metal and wood like blood through veins. "Now they're going to remember how to set things right." But even as hope rose among the freed prisoners, a new sound cut through the night. From somewhere deep in the ship's hold came a laugh, Morris's laugh, though Morris himself had been swept overboard. The sound carried harmonics that made the air itself recoil, and in its echo, Adana heard the voice of something far older and darker than any human sorcerer. The final battle was only beginning. The ancient logbook surfaced like a drowning, man's last breath pushing up through dark water that had begun seeping through the captain's cabin floor. Its leather binding was black with age, its pages warped by generations of sea spray, but the writing inside burned with an inner light that made Adana's eyes water. "This isn't Morris's hand," Richardson said, studying the glowing script. "These entries go back centuries. Look at the dates, 1542, 1423, 1312. "That's impossible," Mercy whispered, but they all knew they'd left the realm of possible things far behind. The logbook's pages turned themselves, driven by an unseen wind. Each entry was written in the same hand, though the ink changed from iron gall to squid ink to something darker that seemed to move on the page. And each entry began the same way. "I, Captain Morris." He wasn't just one man, Adana realized, reading entries that spanned hundreds of years. The name wasn't inherited from father to son. It was the same Morris, wearing different faces, feeding the deep generation after generation. The latest entry was still wet, the ink glistening like fresh blood. "The vessel remembers. The chains remember. But I remember longest of all. Did they think the sea could claim me? I am become the deep's favorite son, and what it loves, it keeps. As if summoned by the words, Morris's laugh echoed through the ship again. Not from the hold this time, but from every drop of water that had soaked into the wooden planks over centuries of dark voyages. "Show yourself," Adana commanded, but Mercy caught her arm. "Look," she said, pointing to the logbook's pages. Where water dripped onto the ancient paper, new words formed. "Why show what you've already seen? I am the ship. I am the chains. I'm every soul sacrificed to the deep's hunger." The truth hit Adana like a physical blow. Morris hadn't just been feeding power to the ship. He'd become one with it, spreading himself through every piece of metal and wood that had tasted sacrifice. Even now, she could feel him watching through the eyes of enchanted nails, listening through timber soaked in blood magic. The logbook's pages continued turning, revealing the full horror of Morris's transformation. The first Captain Morris had, indeed, been human, a sorcerer who discovered the sleeping deep's true nature, but instead of fleeing from the ancient horror he found there, he'd struck a bargain. The deep would share its power, allow him to live far beyond a mortal span, in exchange for regular sacrifices of human essence. The chains were never meant to just hold captives, old Joseph said, his voice shaking as he read entries describing ritual after ritual. They were conduits, drawing out people's souls bit by bit, feeding them to whatever lives in the deep. "And the ship?" Richardson asked. Adana turned to the final pages, where Morris's earliest entries were recorded. It was built from the wreckage of slave ships that went down in these waters. Every plank, every nail came from vessels that had already tasted death. He raised it from the seafloor like raising a corpse, gave it unholy life through sacrifice. The logbook suddenly slammed shut, nearly taking off Richardson's fingers. The water seeping up through the floorboards began to move with purpose, forming patterns that matched the symbols from the navigator's charts. "Did you think knowledge would save you?" Morris's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "The deep doesn't care what you know. It hungers, and I have promised it the richest feast it has ever tasted." The ship shuddered, timbers crying out. As Morris exerted his full control, enchanted wood began to twist, trying to trap them in the cabin. But Adana was ready. She had seen the truth in the logbook's pages, not just horror, but weakness. "You're wrong," she said, pulling power from the sea itself. "Knowledge is memory, and memory is power. The deep may have given you long life, but the sea—" She smiled, feeling the vast presence of the ocean press against the hull. "The sea remembers what you once were, what you truly are." She began to sing, not the battle songs of before, but something older, a naming song her grandmother had taught her, meant to strip away disguise and reveal true natures. The broken chains still hovering in the air took up the melody, their fragments chiming like tiny bells. The water patterns on the floor faltered. For just a moment, they showed not Morris's carefully drawn symbols, but the true shape of the thing he had become, a twisted amalgamation of man and magic, bound to the deep by chains of his own making. "You think you command these waters?" Morris's voice held an edge of fear now. "I have sailed them for centuries." "No," Adana countered, her voice carrying harmonics that made the logbook's pages flutter. "You've hidden in them, preying on the weak, feeding on the bound. But you forgot the first truth of the sea." She held up the logbook, letting her power flow through its pages. "Water flows, water changes, water remembers, and we—" She gestured to the freed prisoners around her. "We are the sea's chosen children, not its thief." The logbook began to glow brighter, its pages turning again, but this time showing new words written in shimmering blue light. The true names of water and wind, the songs of tide and storm, all the knowledge Morris had corrupted, now revealed, in its original form. "The deep may have given you power," Adana declared, "but the sea itself will take it back." The ship screamed, a sound of wood and water and centuries-old rage. The battle for control had truly begun, and its outcome would determine not just their fate, but the future of these waters and everything that dwelled in their depths. The whalebone whistle emerged from the darkest corner of Morris's cabin, rolling across the warped floorboards as if called. Ancient beyond reckoning, yellowed with age, its surface was carved with spiraling patterns that matched both the navigator's charts and the symbols on Adana's broken chains. "Don't touch it," Richardson warned, but his cry came too late. Mercy had already lifted the whistle, and the moment her fingers closed around it, every drop of water on the ship went still. The whistle pulsed with a faint blue light, the same shade as Adana's power. But beneath that glow, darker lights shifted, greens and purples that spoke of abyssal depths where light had never reached. The bone felt warm against Mercy's skin, almost alive, as if the creature it had come from wasn't quite dead, merely dreaming. "It's older than Morris," Adana said, feeling the whistle's power resonate with her own. "Older than his bargain with the deep. This belonged to someone like me once." The ship groaned around them, Morris's presence pressing in through every timber. "Clever girl." His voice rippled through puddles of seawater. "But do you know what? That whistle truly is what it can call from the depths. We know it's not yours to command anymore," Mercy answered, holding the whistle out to Adana. "Like everything else you've stolen, it remembers its true purpose." As Adana's fingers touched the bone, visions flashed through her mind. Memories, stored in the whistle's ancient marrow. She saw other women like her, daughters of the sea stretching back through centuries. They had used the whistle not to command the ocean's creatures, but to call them as allies, as friends. "The seas have never been empty," she said, understanding flooding her. "Even before humans built ships, before they forged chains, there were powers in the deep. The whistle doesn't control them. It reminds them of old promises, old friendships." Morris's laugh shivered through the ship's bones. "Then blow it, little truth speaker, call them. But remember, these waters belong to the deep now. Let's see if your ancient friends remember you after so many years of darkness." Adana lifted the whistle to her lips, but old Joseph caught her wrist. "Wait," he said, "the old stories speak of prices. Nothing from the deep gives aid without cost." "He's right," Richardson added. "Morris didn't bind himself to the deep by accident. There are things down there older than goodness, older than mercy." But Adana saw something in the whistles. Carvings that they didn't, a pattern within the pattern, a song written in spiral script. "The price was already paid," she said softly, "by my grandmother and hers before her, going back to the first woman who learned the sea's songs. We've been keeping the old promises for generations without knowing it." She began to sing, letting her voice harmonize with the ship's still tolling bell. The broken chains dancing in the air took up the melody, their fragments chiming like stars made sound. When the whistle's note finally joined the song, it was both deeper and higher than human ears were meant to hear. The effect was immediate. The sea itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then, from the depths, something answered. The first call came from so deep it shook the ship's hull, a voice like mountains dreaming. Another reply echoed from the west, then the east, high crystalline notes that could have been whale song, but carried harmonies no earthly creature should know. "Yes!" Morris's voice held triumph rather than fear. "Call them! Let them come and see what their precious waters have become." The ship's transformation accelerated. Wooden planks writhed like living tissue, sprouting spikes and tentacles of twisted grain. Dark water poured up through the boards, no longer taking the shape of symbols, but forming into grasping hands and hungry mouths. But Adana stood her ground, the whistle's song never faltering. The broken chains whirled faster around her, and the red cutlass fragments joined their dance, metal singing to metal as an ancient harmony built in the air. Through the whistle's power, she felt them approaching, vast shapes moving through. The deep, drawn by a call their kind had not heard in centuries. Some were creatures that still swam in mundane seas, grown wise and strange through long years. Others were beings that had retreated to lightless trenches when humans first built ships, waiting for the day the old songs would call them home. "Can you feel them?" she asked Mercy, who still held the black coral they'd taken from Morris. "The deep isn't the only power in these waters. It's just the hungriest, the loudest. But there are older things stirring now, remembering who they once called friend. The ship buckled as something vast passed beneath its keel. Phosphorescent patterns rippled through the waves, not Morris's corrupted symbols, but older signs that made the whistle pulse with answering light. "The sea remembers," Adana called out to the darkness wearing Morris's voice. "Not just the sacrifices you fed it, but the songs we sang before your kind ever dreamed of chains. Did you think you were the first to seek power in these waters? The first to believe you could bind the ocean to your will?" The whistle's note changed, deepening to a tone that made the air itself vibrate in sympathy. More voices answered from the deep, and with each response, the ship's twisted transformations began to falter. Morris's power was great, built on centuries of stolen lives, but it was a young thing compared to what now stirred in the depths. "You dare—" Morris's voice held real fear now. "You dare call them? These waters are mine. The deep crowned me its king." "The deep," Adana answered, "is about to remember that it was never meant to rule these seas alone." The whistle's song reached its crescendo, and the ocean answered with a voice that shook the world. Richardson pulled the journal from his sea chest as chaos erupted above deck. Its pages were dog-eared and salt-stained, but the prophecy written on the final page glowed with the same otherworldly light as the ancient logbook. "When the chained one sings, the deep will remember it was not the first power to rule these waters. The sea's daughter will unweave what centuries of dark bargains have woven." "My grandfather was first mate on this ship too," Richardson said, his voice trembling. "He wrote this the night he died, in handwriting that wasn't his own." The next morning, they found him with his eyes turned pearl white, like he'd seen into the deep places of the world. A tremendous crash from above cut through his words. The crew had finally fractured, splitting between those who still served Morris's lingering presence and those who had seen enough horror to choose rebellion. The sounds of steel on steel rang out across the deck, punctuated by inhuman screams as the ship itself took sides in the battle. "Choose!" Hawkins' voice carried over the chaos. "Choose now, you gutless dogs! Stand with Morris and live forever, or die with the witch and her water-cursed followers." But his words were undermined by the sight of the things now rising alongside. The ship, vast shapes that glowed with their own internal light, creatures that had answered the whalebone whistle's call. Their presence made many of the crew drop their weapons, falling to their knees in primal terror. Adana climbed to the quarterdeck, the broken chains still dancing around her like a shield of starlight. The journal in Richardson's hands began to smoke, its prophecy burning brighter as she took each step. "It's not about choosing sides," she called out, her voice carrying harmonics that made the combat pause. "It's about remembering what you are. Every sailor knows the sea demands respect, not chains. Every ship's crew knows you don't fight, the ocean's will." "Pretty words," Hawkins spat, but his face had gone pale as one of the deep-dwelling creatures breached beside the ship. Its body was longer than 3 ships laid end to end, its scales reflecting patterns of light that had never been seen above the surface. "But Morris's power is real. The deep's hunger is real. What are you offering except death?" Richardson stepped forward, holding up his grandfather's journal. "The truth, the deep isn't the only power in these waters. It's not even the oldest. Morris didn't tell you everything he learned over his centuries of sailing. He didn't tell you about them." As if in response to his words, more shapes emerged from the waves, not just the giant creatures, but smaller forms that glowed with pale blue light. They looked almost human, but their eyes held the wisdom of ages, and their movements through water had nothing to do with human limitations. "The sea folk," old Joseph breathed. The old stories were true. The journal's prophecy blazed even brighter, and now everyone could see the words writing themselves across its final pages. The bargain was false from the beginning. The deep promised power, but the true strength of the ocean has always belonged to those who asked instead of taking, who sang instead of commanding. More of the crew threw down their weapons as understanding dawned. They had all heard stories of the sea folk as children, tales of beings who could grant safe passage or doom a ship with a single song. Beings that had retreated into the deep, places of the world when humans began to chain the ocean's power instead of respecting it. But Hawkins and his most loyal followers weren't ready to surrender Morris's dark promises. They charged forward, their weapons still glowing with sickly green light. "The deep gave us power," Hawkins screamed. "Real power, not fairy tales and fish people." The battle that followed would be told in sailors' stories for generations. The journal's prophecy burned so bright it cast shadows backward in time, illuminating not just the deck, but the memory of every dark deed done upon it. Those who fought for Morris found their enchanted weapons turning in their hands, centuries of stolen power finally, remembering its true nature. Yet the price of revelation was high. 3 of the freed prisoners fell defending Richardson as he read aloud from the journal, each word undermining another strand of Morris's centuries-long spell. Mercy took a wound that made her skin grow transparent as sea foam, and only the touch of the whalebone whistle kept her from dissolving entirely. The ship itself began to tear apart, timbers screaming as they remembered being part of other vessels, honest ships that had never asked to be raised from their rightful graves and stitched into Morris's abomination. The deck buckled and split, and through the gaps, Adana could see the deep's darkness rising to meet them. "It comes." Morris's voice rippled through every drop of water on the ship. "My true master arrives to claim what was promised. All your pretty prophecies can't stop that." But there was fear in his voice now. Fear of the sea folk swimming alongside the ship, fear of the ancient creatures that had answered the whistle's call, and most of all, fear of what the journal's final prophecy revealed about the bargain he'd struck so long ago. "You were never meant to live forever," Adana read from the journal's burning pages. "The deep fed you lies along with power, made you think you were special, chosen, but you were just another meal it was fattening for the final feast. And now," she smiled, as the whalebone whistle pulsed in harmony with her words, "now it's time for the sea to remember who truly rules these waters." The journal burst into blue flame as the last prophecy wrote itself across the sky in letters of lightning. The chains remember, the ships remember, and the deep itself will remember why it once feared the children of the tide. The final battle for the soul of the ocean was about to begin. When Adana slipped beneath the waves, the sea embraced her like a long-lost daughter. The black pearl appeared before her, suspended in the depths like a captured star, its surface reflecting impossibilities. Within its perfect blackness, she saw the true face of the ocean, not just water and salt, but memory given form, power older than human dreams of conquest. The sea folk swam circles around her, their bodies trailing light like liquid moonfire. They didn't speak, not in ways human ears could understand, but the pearl translated their song, "The deep's hunger grows." Morris fed it well, taught it to crave the essence of bound souls. Now it wants everything. Through the pearl's darkness, Adana saw the truth of their words. Below, in the lightless depths, something vast was stirring. The deep wasn't just a place. It was an entity, ancient and ravenous, grown fat on centuries of Morris's sacrifices. Its consciousness pressed against her mind like a mountain of cold water, trying to crush her will. But the pearl's light held it back, creating a sphere of clarity in which older magics could still work. The sea folk's songs grew stronger within its influence, and Adana felt her grandmother's teachings resurface in her blood. The ocean does not belong to those who chain it, but to those who remember its first songs. She sang into the depths, her voice, carrying through water, made sudden crystal by the pearl's power. The broken chains that had followed her beneath the surface began to spin, faster and faster, creating a vortex that drew in Morris's centuries of stolen power like a whirlpool pulling in driftwood. "You cannot unmake what I have wrought." Morris's voice bubbled up from below, but it was weaker here, in the realm of honest water. The deep has grown too strong, too hungry. It will devour everything, even the memories you hold so dear. The pearl pulsed once, and Adana saw the terrible truth, saw how the deep had changed over centuries of Morris's dark bargains. What had once been merely a place of power, neither good nor evil, had been corrupted into something monstrous. Morris thought himself its master, but he was just the first course in an endless feast. She had only moments before the deep's full. Her attention turned to her. The pearl's protection wouldn't last long against such ancient hunger, but in its perfect black surface, she saw what needed to be done. Not a battle to be won, but a memory to be awakened. Remember, she sang to the waters around her, letting the pearl amplify her voice until it reached even the darkest trenches. Remember what you were before the chains, before the sacrifices, before the deep learned to hunger for bound souls. The sea folk joined their voices to hers, and for a moment she saw their true forms through the pearl's revealing light. Beings of pure music, wearing bodies of flesh only when they chose. Their song carried the memory of the first waters when the ocean was young and free. The deep stirred, and the pearl grew brighter still, its light now painful to behold. But in that searing radiance, Adana saw the way forward, not through battle, but through remembrance. It was time to wake the sea. The storm-glass rose from the depths in Adana's wake, carried by two sea folk whose bodies flickered like heat lightning. Within its crystalline chamber, impossible weather raged, not just rain and wind, but the very essence of storms distilled into visible form. As Adana broke the surface, she saw in its swirling patterns the truth of what was coming. The glass shows what must be, the sea folk sang in voices like breaking waves. When the deep rises, the sky must answer. Balance demands it. Within the glass, miniature lightning forked through clouds no bigger than her thumb. But these weren't natural. Storms brewing. The patterns spoke of older weather, the kind that had raged before humans drew their first breath, when the sky and sea still warred for dominion of the world. Morris knew, Richardson said, helping her back aboard what remained of the ship. That's why he needed souls with power in them. The deep isn't just hungry, it's trying to grow strong enough to reach the sky again, to resume an ancient war. The storm-glass pulsed with confirmation, its internal tempest growing more violent. Through its faceted surface, Adana saw the truth of the coming convergence, not just Morris's carefully plotted star patterns, but something larger, older. The deep wasn't rising by accident. It had been waiting for this moment for millennia. Above, the real sky began to mirror the glass's prophecy. Clouds formed in impossible spirals, their shapes echoing the symbols from the navigator's charts. Lightning walked between sea and sky in chains of light that matched the patterns of her broken bonds. The weather itself was remembering older ways of being. "We have minutes," Mercy warned, clutching the whalebone whistle. "Look!" The storm-glass had turned black as the pearl. But within its darkness, Adana saw the deep's vast form beginning its final ascent. Morris's laughter rode the rising wind, no longer bound to the ship's timbers, but free in the air itself. "You're too late," his voice exulted. "The deep remembers its old hunger now, its old ambitions. Did you think your pretty songs could stop the tide of centuries?" But Adana smiled, seeing in the storm-glass what Morris could not. "The tide," she said softly, "is exactly what will stop you." The glass's prophecy was clear now, showing not just the storm above, but the deeper weather that moved through, the waters of the world. The sea remembers, her grandmother had taught her, but it does more than that. The sea rises. The captain's sword hung suspended in the air between sea and sky, its steel rippling like water caught in moonlight. The sea serpents engraved along its blade had begun to move, their silver forms writhing as ancient magic awakened in the metal. This was no mere weapon. It was the key Morris had used to seal his bargain with the deep, centuries ago. "Take it," the sea folk sang as the blade turned slowly in the storm-charged air. "The sword remembers its first purpose." Adana reached for the hilt, But Morris's voice cracked like thunder. "That blade has tasted the blood of 100 sea daughters. It knows who its true master is." The sword blurred, moving with impossible speed toward Adana's heart. But the broken chains that still danced around her caught it, holding the blade in a web of singing metal. In that moment of contact, every engraved serpent blazed with blue fire. Memory flooded through the connection, not just Morris's memories of dark bargains and stolen power, but older recollections carved into the steel itself. The sword had not always been a thing of betrayal. It had been forged in deeper waters by the sea folk themselves, meant as a gift to those rare humans who could speak the ocean's oldest languages. "You corrupted it," Adana accused as lightning walked across the waves. "Like you corrupted everything else you touched." The deep's massive form rose higher, its bulk now visible even to normal eyes as a mountain of darkness that made the storm above look like a child's drawing. Morris's laughter echoed from within that darkness, but there was an edge of desperation to it now. "Corruption? I gave it purpose, power. What good is a blade that won't cut, a sea that won't serve?" The sword trembled in the chain's grasp, its serpent engravings moving faster, as if agitated by the lie. Through her connection to the blade, Adana felt its true nature struggling to break free of centuries of misuse. She began to sing, pitching her voice to match the harmonics she felt running through the steel. The sea folk joined her, their chorus rising above the storm's fury. One by one, the serpent engravings began to still their frantic writhing, turning their silver heads to listen. "Remember," Adana sang to the blade. "Remember what you were meant to be." The sword's steel began to glow with the same blue light as her broken chains. The serpents moved again, but differently now, no longer in chaos, but in patterns that matched the navigator's charts, the prophecies in Richardson's journal, the ancient warnings carved into the whalebone whistle. Morris screamed in rage and fear as his last weapon of power turned against him. The sword pulled free of the chain's grasp, but instead of attacking, it began to dance, cutting through air and water with impossible precision, carving symbols of unbinding that made the very reality around them shiver. The deep's vast form shuddered as the sword's dance continued. Where the blade passed, darkness turned to light, corruption burned away like mist in morning sun. The ancient entity's hunger began to fade as the sword undid centuries of Morris's influence, one shining arc at a time. "No," Morris's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "I am its master, I am—" The sword moved one final time, too fast for even Adana's enhanced senses to follow, but she felt the impact as the blade struck true, cutting not through flesh, but through the very bonds that had kept Morris's soul intact through centuries of dark bargains. For one moment she saw him clearly, not as the immortal power he'd pretended to be, but as the scared, greedy man who'd first stumbled upon the deep secrets. Then the sword's light flared brighter than lightning, and Morris's presence began to unravel like rope, too long submerged. But the battle was far from over. The deep's hunger might be fading, but its power remained vast and terrible. As Morris's control failed, that power began to run wild, threatening to tear apart the boundary between sea and sky. The sword turned in the air to face Adana, its serpent engravings now perfectly still, waiting. She knew what she had to do, what the blade had been forged for in the first place. It had never been meant as a weapon, but as a tool of healing, of setting right what had been thrown out of balance. She reached for the hilt as the storm above reached its peak. The ship's wheel transformed beneath Adana's hands, its wooden form flowing like water as ancient magic awakened. Where once there had been simple spokes of oak, now curved patterns emerged, the same spiral forms that marked the navigator's charts, that moved through the sword-serpent engravings, that danced in the storm-glass's prophecies. "The wheel turns all things," the sea folk sang as they circled the disintegrating ship. "Even time, even fate." The deep's massive form towered above them, no longer bound by Morris's will, but somehow worse in its freedom. a vast darkness that threatened to devour sky and sea alike. But as Adana gripped the transformed wheel, she felt something else stirring in the waters below, the memory of what these seas had been before Morris's corruption, before the deep learned to hunger for. Bound souls, you feel it too, Mercy said, her form becoming translucent as the wound from the blood-forged blade took its toll. The way things should be. Adana nodded, understanding finally dawning. The wheel wasn't just for steering ships, it was older than ships, older than human journeys across water. It was the circle of completion, of return, of setting right what had been thrown out of balance. The captain's sword hung suspended before her, its serpent engravings moving in perfect synchronization with the wheel's patterns. The broken chains that had followed her through every battle now began to orbit both artifacts, forming a complex geometry of light and memory. "The price must be paid," the sea folk warned, their voices carrying above the storm's fury. "Balance demands it." Adana looked at Mercy, seeing how her friend's edges were beginning to blur into sea foam. She saw Richardson clutching his grandfather's prophetic journal, its pages now burning with blue fire. She watched old Joseph holding the whalebone whistle, his eyes reflecting deeper waters than any human should know. She understood the price. Freedom wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about restoring what was broken, remembering what was forgotten, returning what was stolen. "I know," she said, and began to sing. This song was different from all the others, not a battle cry or a summoning, but a song of ending and beginning combined. The wheel turned beneath her hands, not in any direction a ship could sail, but through deeper currents of reality itself. The sword serpents took up her song, their silver forms rippling as they added ancient harmonies. The broken chains joined next, each fragment chiming a note that spoke of liberation. Even the storm, Glass's miniature tempests, seemed to move in time with the melody. As the song built, Adana felt the weight of centuries pressing against her will. Every soul Morris had sacrificed, every life bound and broken to feed the deep's hunger, every drop of blood spilled in the name of power, all of it hung in the balance, waiting to be set right. The wheel turned again, and reality turned with it. Mercy gasped as her form began to solidify, the blood-forged blade's corruption unwinding as time itself responded to the wheel's movement. Richardson's journal burned brighter, its prophecies not just describing the future now, but helping to shape it. The deep's vast form shuddered as the song reached its peak. This was the moment of choice, the price of freedom about to come due. Adana felt the wheel growing warmer beneath her hands, felt the power building to impossible levels. All things return, she sang into the heart of the storm. All debts are paid, all waters remember their first songs. The wheel flared with blinding light, and Adana felt herself beginning to change. Not dying, not disappearing, but transforming, becoming something that could bridge the gap between human and sea, between memory and present, between what was corrupted and what could be healed. The last thing she saw as a purely human woman was Mercy's face, understanding and grief mingled in her eyes. The last thing she felt was the wheel's pattern burning itself into her palms, marking her as something new in the world. Then the light took her, and the great wheel of time and tide began its final turn. The silver compass emerged from the settling waters 3 days after the great turning, its needle spinning in patterns that matched the rhythm of the waves. Unlike Morris's corrupted instruments, this compass didn't point north, it pointed toward truth, toward destiny, toward the deeper currents that ran beneath the surface of reality. Mercy held it now, standing on the deck of a new ship, one built from uncorrupted wood and honest iron. The compass's face shifted like moonlight on water, showing her glimpses of what had become of her friend. For Adana was still there, though. Changed. The sea folk called her the tide speaker now, her form shifting between woman and wave, between flesh and flowing water. Sometimes they caught glimpses of her dancing through phosphorescent swells at night, her laughter carrying harmonics that made ship's bells ring in sympathy. "She hasn't left us," Richardson said, watching the compass needle track something. Invisible across the waves. She's become what she was always meant to be, a bridge between worlds. The deep had retreated to its proper place, its hunger transformed back into the natural rhythms of the sea. Morris's centuries of corruption had been undone, though the price had been high. The waters remembered their true nature now, and strange new stories were already spreading through ports across the world. Tales of ships guided safely through storms by a woman's singing, of drowning sailors rescued by hands made of sea light, of ancient bargains renewed between humanity and the ocean's eldest children. The silver compass gleamed in Mercy's hands, its needle suddenly steady. She smiled, feeling the familiar presence in the waves below. She's calling us home. They say the ocean's memory still sings on moonlit nights, its voice carried in every wave that breaks against a ship's hull. The sea folk call it the final artifact, not an object but the water itself, forever changed by a woman who chose to become something more than human, to set right an ancient wrong. In ports across the world, sailors whisper that if you listen closely during the midnight watch, you can hear her story in the rhythm of the tide, how the chained one rose, how the deep remembered, how the sea itself awoke to set its children free.